Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name's Tom Duval. I'm a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, working on Eastern Europe. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this Carnegie Europe webinar, which is going to be about Central and Eastern Europe and Russian gas. And I'm delighted to have two extremely distinguished experts with us to discuss this today over the next hour. First of all, Max Hess, who's the founder and manager of Enmetena Advisory, and also the author of the book Economic War, which you can see behind Max, an excellent study of the economic war between Russia and the West and the sanctions which have been in place since 2022. And Max is the author of a paper which came out at the end of April, which we'll be discussing, which is called How Eastern Europe Overhauled Its Natural Gas Market. It's all about the main issue we'll be discussing today, which is the big transformation in Central and Eastern Europe's transition from the use of Russian gas. We're also, I'm delighted to say, joined by a huge expert on Russian Eurasian energy issues, our Carnegie colleague from Berlin, Sergey Vakulenko. He's a senior fellow with the Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. So two terrific experts here today. What we're going to do is we're going to have a brief presentation by Max of the issues, up around 10 minutes, some responses by Sergey, and then we're turning it over to you. Please write your questions in the chat. I will then read them out and put them to our two experts. We have 1 hour. That should be enough, but we'll try and keep things quite zippy and brief. So basically, the issue that we're talking about is this huge transformation in the gas market across Europe, particularly in what we're calling Eastern Europe, the kind of former socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which used to have this massive reliance on Russian gas. Max will give us the numbers, but that's certainly been cut drastically in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine began. And then we've had a further transformation at the end of last year with the suspension of the Ukraine transit gas route, which I think had been in place since, again, Max will give us the numbers, but for more than half a century, I believe. A lot of reasons for this: solidarity with Ukraine, Russia's own actions, and obviously a big rise in the LNG market are some of the factors that we'll be discussing. Also, I think a big role for Turkey. And then I guess the question that we're all asking is this a permanent shift? Is this sustainable? Or is there a possibility that we'll see some backsliding and a change in this situation? So first of all, welcome to you both, and I'll start with a presentation by Max.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to be here with Sergey and Tom and to talk to you about these topics today. Really, the point of this paper in particular is to try to answer the question, how did Eastern Europe fall into this particular gas crisis in 2022, and how has it overcome it to shift its dependencies away from Russia? We saw only a tiny handful of countries that were relatively independent of Russian natural gas before the full-scale invasion in 2022. Only Romania, which has its own domestic production, and Albania and Kosovo, which relied on Albania's production, didn't import more than 50% of their gas from Russia, of the Eastern European countries in question here, before 2022. We've now seen those figures fall dramatically to 0% in some countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Croatia, Poland. We've seen it come down in almost every country except for North Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, which are very, very small importers overall. We've even seen it come down significantly in Slovakia and Hungary, the countries that have taken the sort of leading voice against it. And also in Austria, it's only come down a fairly small amount. But overall, Russia was the dominant supplier before 2022, and it has now gone to being a marginal supplier. this is in some ways been a self-inflicted wound by Russia. And I think that when we sit back and talk about sanctions and this economic warfare and where we are today, we often forget some of the key developments that happened in 2021 and in 2022. Remember, Putin had started toggling the gas deliveries to Europe on and off even before the full-scale invasion. We saw Russia prepare with some of its closer partners for the shifting of routes. For example, Hungary stopped importing via Nordstream 1 already in 2021 and shifted this to the Turkish routes that ultimately come in via the Balkan Stream pipeline. And then when Russia did its full-scale invasion, Europe had a very large amount of difficulty agreeing on sanctions around Russian gas, precisely because of this dependency in the region and also in Central European countries, Germany most of all. Germany plays an important role in this story, which we'll come to a little bit later, with its own alternative gas import sources and the role that it plays in Europe's overall LNG market. But at the time, of course, Russia was just looking to complete and bring online at the beginning of 2022 the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This would have doubled the capacity of the Nord Stream route to around 55 billion cubic meters. Remember, Russia in the year before only exported just over 63 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe. So this would have really changed the importance of the Ukrainian route anyway. Now, this has been a core issue in European geopolitics for over 20 years. Russia would toggle on and off supplies via Eastern Europe already back in the 2000s in response to other political developments or contractual developments in Ukraine that Russia was unhappy with. The key takeaway, I think, for the purposes of this discussion is that, however, that it also would have bifurcated Europe's gas market quite heavily if Russia had succeeded in bringing Nord Stream 2 online as well. Essentially, Russia would be able to get all of the gas that it wanted to its Central European customers and even more, while choosing to either entirely cut Ukraine or entirely cut Eastern Europe off via its own gas supplies, as those transshipments to Central Europe, Germany, and those countries would no longer have had to be routed via Ukraine. Of course, Russia's strategy in building the Turk Stream pipelines and Blue Stream pipelines over the last 20 years has also played a key role in this attempt to build alternative routes to Ukraine. But to be clear, it wasn't a issue of Russia seeing that it saw a huge increase in European demand that necessitated that. There was demand increases in Turkey, but it was really an attempt to change that supply network. And in 2022, we also saw Russia make a number of key demands aimed at hindering other sanctions, such as the attempts to demand payments for rubles in gas to keep currency conversions networks open into Europe. And it was Russia that turned off the pipelines in a lot of places and halted deliveries to countries even before the explosions on the Nord Stream routes. To come to Europe's real adaptation, however, the most important points are twofold: the role of LNG and the role of Turkey in this market. So Turkey is a huge importer of about 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year, but now has spare export capacity of around 25 billion cubic meters in the gas that it has contracted. Its key contracts with Russia over the next year have to be, for its gas purchases, have to be renegotiated. It's also the key supplier of the alternative routes via the so-called EU-backed Southern Corridor, the gas that comes from Azerbaijan, a little over 12 billion cubic meters in the last year. And then Turkey has really expanded its LNG capacity. So it serves as a global hub for those imports, re-exports a lot of that LNG, and also is looking to develop its own gas resources in the future. Eastern Europe has a number of other LNG terminals as well, and projects that really began in 2014 and gained a lot of speed in the years before the full-scale invasion, but which have long been motivated by a fear of Russian dependency. So Croatia has the Krk terminal with 6 billion cubic meters. Poland has one terminal, Svinucia, with just over 8 billion cubic meters, is building another in Gdansk with 6 billion cubic meters of capacity. Lithuania has a small terminal with just those three. And then Greece has really been the other major growth story with its own 10 billion cubic meters in import capacity. Eastern Europe does also get imports ultimately via the German terminals that have been built over recent years. But broadly, we can say that there's 30 billion cubic meters of gas capacity in LNG imports today, more growth in those terminals coming in the coming years. And then Turkey has the 25 billion cubic meters in capacity, although that includes a significant amount of Russian purchases at present. The EU is presently debating whether it will impose new sanctions to stop LNG imports into Europe. Those have primarily been a feature of Western European economies rather than the Eastern European terminals that I just spoke about, as well as trying to block future shipments via the Turk Stream and Balkan Stream routes. Although Serbia is not an EU member, this would require a huge change in Serbia's approach, where gas dependency has remained very high on Russia, and of course potentially lead to another standoff with Hungary and Slovakia in their present governments that are pro-continuing this trade. And it is also a key question in Austrian politics, where the current Austrian government favors it, but the largest single party and the main opposition party, the FPÖ, is very much in favor of returning to actually increasing Russian shipments. And Austria is very important in this and will be in the future because of the role of the Baumgarten gas hub, a key hub outside Vienna, just on the border with Slovakia, that ultimately may see a lot of its gas rerouted and ultimately become a hub in the future for supplying Eastern Europe via Central European supplies, rather than being this endpoint for Russian supplies that it historically had been. The last point I just want to make really quickly is this has not been an effort without costs. The contract costs in buying spot gas in 2022 and 2023 was particularly painful for a lot of countries. It has been particularly painful for the electricity systems a lot. We've seen Eastern European countries and their governments adopt the same kind of measures that we saw in a lot of Western European countries, with ultimately gas price caps and financial support to the key actors in the electricity sector in those countries who were essentially selected to take the pain. It did vary in different markets between distributors and producers, but a lot of this has been supported by increase in debt guarantees from the European Investment Bank as well. So it's important to remember that the success of European cohesion has been a key factor in keeping those costs manageable and keeping firms creditworthy and able to strike these new agreements. Price dynamics will change in the future. There are perhaps more reasons to fear oversupply in future gas markets today than there were in 2022, and a lot of contractual questions about how the gas spot market will develop. This was overall a big story in the global trend that we saw between 2014 and 2022, when gas prices spread around the world out of this conflict, whereas the overall market dynamics in the US and in Asian markets were unaffected by relatively unaffected by Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And then finally, the question of Turkey and its role and the risks of dependency on one large, if not producer, ultimately import route, and how that question can be balanced out by additional cooperation with the rest of Europe and with the LNG industry going forward. So thank you, and I hope that this has prompted lots of questions. You can obviously find the full report and a lot more numbers on individual countries on the Carnegie website.
Thanks so much, Max. Yeah, absolutely. You can hopefully on your screen you can see where you can read Max's report. Also, Sergey Vakulenko has also written extensively about this issue, and there'll be a link to his page as well. So Sergey, over to you for some thoughts from you.
Right. Some of the things of this Russian-European gas relationship might by now have only academic interest to historians, and it's a long and interesting story, rather multifaceted and multi-faced. This year, we would be celebrating 60 years of Russian-European gas relationship, of course, if it wouldn't almost die at the beginning of this year. But there are certain things that are probably worth mentioning. They might add some color to the picture. One of them, for example, why in the first place did Russia want to build, and Gazprom, not only Russia, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2? Sure, there were political reasons for it. Sure, Russian-Ukrainian gas relationship were quite tumultuous and quite uneasy since 1991. But there are also other reasons. What was happening that traditional Gazprom resource area, Urengoy, was being depleted, and the center of gravity of Gazprom production was shifting northwest to Yamal Peninsula, and Gazprom was thinking how it would be delivering this gas to European markets. It could tap it into the existing gas system that was going through Ukraine, into Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, and then Germany. But that was a very old system. So it would have to be heavily invested to be updated. And also it was built with technologies from 70s and 80s, so it wasn't particularly efficient. Or they could build a new line, which would be shorter, substantially shorter. On the map in Mercator projection, it looks parallel, kind of the same length. But in practice, the Earth cones to the north, so it would be more than 1,000 kilometers shorter. It could be built in modern standards, so to 120 bars instead of 70 as a southern route. And yes, as a nice element to it, it would avoid most of the transit countries. So there were technical reasons, but also political reasons as well. Second element is this dependency of Eastern Europe or Central and Eastern Europe on Russian gas supplies. For Russia, these markets, again, in the 70s, they used as a good tie to strengthen the relationship in Comecon and to tie the Central European economies closer to Soviet Union and also give them a bit of a benefit. But in the 90s and the 2000s, as Gazprom was growing its markets in Germany, France, other countries, the actual economic importance of the sales there was diminishing. These markets were relatively small for Gazprom. And also, if we look at, yes, there could be substantial dependency of Poland, Slovakia, other countries, when we'd be looking at the proportion of Russian gas in these countries' gas basket, it would also be important to take a look at how much a share gas as a fuel takes in these countries' energy balance, and then the picture would be slightly different. For Poland, for example, Poland is a coal country. Coal is the king in Polish gas balance, in Polish energy basket. For Slovakia, it's nuclear. Slovakia is a nuclear country, and bulk of the electricity is generated from the nuclear power stations. To less extent, it's also true for Czech Republic and for Hungary. Sure, gas in those countries takes an important role in communal sector, in heating the water and providing district heating for the Plattenbaus, Panelaks. But for economy as a whole, gas wasn't that important. For Germany, that was another story. And of course, when Nordstream has been built, Russia was thinking that it was already known that Germany would be shutting down its nuclear power stations. There's also projections that Groningen gas field in the Netherlands would be going down and would be turned off because of the environmental concerns, because of the low intensity earthquakes. And Gazprom was highly skeptical of US shale gas and US ability to build absolutely huge LNG capacity on its Gulf Coast. So there are economic reasons for that expansion as well, but political as well. I probably stop here, and we might actually go into discussion and what and
Sure.
how things.
Right. Thank you both. I'm going to try and ask you a sort of the big question, which is there has been this transition. Nordstream, as we know, is currently not functioning. The Ukraine route is currently not functioning. Is there a scenario where Russian gas can return to Europe in its previous volumes, or is that story completely over? Who wants to take that?
I'll answer first. So one of the four routes of the Nord Stream pipelines, in theory, could be repaired. more easily, it is possible to do the rest of the work. I have a hard time seeing any scenario in which Ukraine allows transshipments again. The infrastructure, however, broadly, even if you just take that one remaining route of the 4 Nordstream pipelines and add it to all the other existing infrastructure. In theory, the infrastructure is in place to get Russia back to 60 billion cubic meters of supply annually to Europe again, even without any pipeline repairs. The question is really one of political will elsewhere. I have a very hard time seeing Europe or the US. Obviously, there's a much broader discussion to be had, but getting to the point where they lift enough sanctions to allow a lot of that business to resume. Obviously, depending on the politics at play in a lot of Eastern European countries now, it's certainly much more likely that I do think Hungary will make a big stink about this and others, but it is not impossible that we get the EU Council ruling to formally ban all Russian supplies, as I mentioned. So in theory, yes, it's possible. And if all of a sudden there was a change of power in Russia and you had a government that was willing to cooperate and say, hey, we want to sell more gas and we will stop the invasion of Ukraine and we promise not to politicize this and we'll agree to new terms and contract structures that make that more likely. And then all of Europe can benefit from this renewed trade and low gas prices for everybody. Yeah, in theory, that it could happen, but I think whether it be in business planning or political planning, the idea of renewed Russian gas to Europe anytime soon with the current powers that be in place there should not be counted on and ideally should be ruled out.
Would you
I'd
agree
say
with that? Yeah.
one of the strands of Nord Stream 2 is just intact and it's also full with line fill gas. So it requires actually 2 things. One is certification paper from Germany. Right before the war, the certification process was going on and it was stopped in the run-up to the invasion in a futile attempt to stop Russia from acting full-scale war. So this certification paper needs to be issued. And then it will be just a press of a button that would start the pumps pushing gas towards Germany. This would be it. No repairs. The 3 damaged strands, 1 Nord Stream 2, 2 from Nord Stream 1, could probably be repaired at a cost of, $1 billion, give or take. Whether that would be needed is a good question. Because, again, leaving politics aside, what I hear from Germany that, yes, Germany and German industrialists would like to see some Russian gas in their mix. Not to the amount that it was there before, because that was over-dependency, and then this creates also ability to weaponize it and inflict pain if needed. But to the extent where Germany would know where it could get alternative gas supplies, but until those alternatives would be needed, Germany would enjoy lower cost Russian gas, at least in the eyes of some of the people from business. How much would that be? Well, 27.5, the capacity of Nord Stream 2 remaining strand, sounds around right number. There is a Polish route, which is 20 billion cubic meters per annum. Poland nationalized the pipeline immediately after the beginning of the war. Russia has issued a ban, an embargo on using it, but the line is intact. That's the line that goes via Belarus into Germany. There is Ukrainian system. If you would ask me if, in a strange case, these supplies would restart and ask me to place them in order, I would think that Ukraine would demand that first flow would be going via Ukraine for 2 reasons. So Ukraine wouldn't be excluded from Russian-European business relationship. So Ukraine, if needed, would have some leverage and control on Russian trade. And the third reason is actually beneficial for Ukraine to have that flow, A, for transit payments, B, for making it easier and more convenient supplying Ukrainian network, and C, so that Ukraine would be able to offer at better terms its gas storage in the west of the country to European traders. and enjoy better pricing if it needs to import gas from Europe. And only then there might be Polish route if Poland might have any say on this for similar reasons. And only after that, the Nord Stream might come online. But again, all this depends on whether Europe and Ukraine might be in any mood to restart their business ventures with Russia, which of course resides heavily on politics, on what kind of government is in Russia. Well, never say never. On one hand, very soon after the end of the World War II, we had European Communion of Coal and Steel, the predecessor of EU. On the other hand, there's a pipeline, oil pipeline, that goes from Persian Gulf to Haifa, probably the most convenient and efficient way of transporting oil from Persian Gulf to Europe. And it's sitting idle for the last 80 years.
One last point I just want to raise on this is, even in the sort of best case scenarios, it's a little outside the scope of the paper, but it's also a very important aspect to this that I think has received a lot less general attention is we talked about the economic warfare and the toggling of the pipelines in 2022, but there has, of course, since then been much quieter and less headline-grabbing series of what you could call lawfare over these disputes and the cancellation of these contracts. And so the best, or at least the one that kind of epitomizes the wider trend, is a dispute between Gazprom and the company Uniper, which was nationalized by Germany during this crisis, partially owned by the Finnish state before that, and which didn't own the underlying pipeline infrastructure, but was a financier and a key distributor within Germany of the Russian gas that came between Nord Stream 2. And they have a judgment from a Stockholm arbitration court for $13 billion against Gazprom. Now, Gazprom managed to find a Russian arbitration court that threw up a $14 billion ruling the opposite way in its favor, claiming that Russian lawyers, because of sanctions, were limited in how they could take part in the Swedish dispute. We've seen other aspects like this used to justify further nationalizations within Russia of energy company assets. We've, of course, got Russian claims against some of the nationalizations of Russian assets, whether that be in Poland or Germany and elsewhere. And even with the best of intents in the situation where you do have a new government in Russia and you do have a willingness to begin this all again, once those legal proceedings have been initiated, and certainly once there are claims in the stage that we are now, unwinding all of that and settling it without triggering further lawsuits and injunctions and attempts to seize cargoes, although that's harder with pipeline gas, but certainly happens elsewhere, is something that would be a feature of having to solve this problem in the future.
True, that's a heavily aggravating consideration indeed, because, well, there's also that company that used to be called Gazprom Germania. Yep. Now it's called Secure Energy Future for Europe, SEFE, which controls quite a few of hard assets in Europe: gas storage, gas pipelines, but also it was a holder of many Gazprom gas supply contracts to Europe, and is also a multi-billion lawsuit grounds.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I'm going to read out some questions now we've got from those watching us online. I'm going to begin with one from Robert Anderson. He says Hungary and Slovakia claim they cannot switch off from Russian gas. What alternatives do they have, and how much more expensive would they be for Budapest and Bratislava? Does the same go for Austria? Max.
Sure. So actually, one of the interesting points is that Hungary was less dependent on Russian gas supplies than almost all other Eastern European countries were before the full-scale invasion. It's simply not true when they claim they cannot find other sources. As we said, if you take in the Turkish additional capacity, the build-out of LNG capacity elsewhere in Europe, particularly Germany, and then the existing LNG capacity of the Eastern European countries, including Greece, they have the capacity to replace Russian gas. Hungary, of course, has signed new contracts with Russia on energy supplies. Since then, they may find it politically impossible under the current government, but it certainly cannot be. And in Slovakia, before Fico came back into office, we did see a very heavy effort to push diversification away from it. Austria also has canceled its main Gazprom contract. This will be the source of future litigation, and certainly already has been, but major judgments in the future as well. They had a very long-term contract between OMV, as it's called in English, the major Austrian gas company. Austria, of course, did continue to import, but was dependent on the routes via Ukraine that stopped delivering gas at the beginning of this year. One of the important topics, and this is, while Russia, yes, does supply gas still via Turkey, capacity on that Balkan connector route it is limited. It's enough to continue supplying those countries, but it is limited in how much alone via that route Russia could replace elsewhere. So Russia already has shown a willingness pre-full-scale invasion to change those routes up. I'm sure the Kremlin is very interested, and for the geostrategic planners at Gazprom and across the Russian gas industry and in the Kremlin, this question of keeping Turkish supplies and that route going forward in the future will be very important. But no, it is not true that they simply cannot. There may be technical legal costs to do so, but as other countries have proven, that is a question of will, and Russia is not exactly going to have a lot of luck collecting on claims. It hasn't thus far, obviously due to sanctions, even where it has won judgments.
Right, and as Sergey said, they're actually both of them also quite heavily reliant on nuclear power as well for their energy mix.
But remember, Russia is also very involved in Hungary's nuclear power industry.
Right.
And Slovakia as well.
Slovakia, yeah.
So these power stations were built to Russian designs, and replacing fuel from other source is, well, possible, but it would create quite a few headaches for the station's operators.
Let's talk a little bit about Azerbaijan. We have a question from Richard Kozlarich, former US ambassador to Baku, and someone I know pretty well. Good to see you. Well, not to see you. Good to hear you, Richard. Richard's question is, can Russia bypass restrictions by providing gas to Azerbaijan, where it can substitute for Azerbaijan domestic gas that can then be diverted to increased Azerbaijan exports via the southern route? Let me add on to that, whether you have a comment, Max. We know that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen went to Baku in 2022, and there were some quite ambitious promises about doubling Azerbaijani exports. Since then, some people have urged caution about saying that those numbers of increasing Azerbaijan export to 20 BCM are much too ambitious. But yeah, tell us your thoughts on this.
So I would echo Tom's point around the numbers being far too ambitious, and of course, just highlight for any others who are less familiar with the region than Ambassador Kozlarich. Of course, there have been two conflicts in Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh and with Armenia in the last 5 years. So you're not entirely moving away from conflict risk if you're looking to double down on Azeri supplies. But perhaps Sergey can talk more about the limitations in Azerbaijan's own fields. But even if Azerbaijan does begin doing exactly what Ambassador Kozlarich has laid out in his question and import Russian gas for its own domestic power use to free up more gas for export, the capacity of the existing pipelines via Georgia, Turkey, and then on to Europe are limited. So you have about 16 billion cubic meters through the Trans-Anatolian pipeline, 10 billion cubic meters through the Trans-Adriatic pipeline that then brings gas from Greece on through Albania and Italy. and actually allows that Azeri gas to be delivered more to Central Europe than to Eastern Europe. But those pipelines have operated essentially at full capacity since the full-scale invasion. You would need investment in pipeline expansion there. Azerbaijan has shown interest in the past in building an interconnector to Turkmenistan. Russia has a veto there. I don't think it's going to happen. Obviously, for the companies invested in existing infrastructure there, whether that be the pipelines or Azerbaijan's own fields. There are reasons that some of them may be interested in expanding this relationship as well. But currently it is not certainly free of risks, despite hopes for progress in peace negotiations and normalization negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But at present, even if, to come back to the question, even if Azerbaijan did engage in those swaps from Russia, the export capacity isn't there. And I certainly think it would be a complete failure of the entire ethos of the Southern gas corridor and EU backing for that to have it become another backdoor for Russian gas to get into Europe. So as there are discussions in the future, and if there is hope that Azerbaijan's pipeline should be expanded, it should only be done so on the premise that it would be with non-Russian supply that ultimately fills that, in my opinion. As to how realistic that is, I'm happy to go into it further, but Sergey may have some more thoughts there as well. We were just chatting about it before this call began.
Right. Azerbaijan has actually been buying Russian gas with the idea exactly to release as much gas as possible for exports towards Europe because, well, Russia is oversupplied, so Azerbaijan can enjoy much lower prices for the gas that comes from Russia than what it earns for exported volumes. But then again, the capacity of the pipeline going from Dagestan into Azerbaijan is quite limited. It's just single BCMs. So in theory, yes, this swapping might happen to some extent, but it's definitely not particularly material. It's not strategic amounts and volumes we're talking about. In theory, yes, Russia could probably expand and bring that pipeline, old pipeline, up to date and use at some later date the Southern gas corridor capacity to export its volumes from Astrakhan and maybe even from other pipelines when Shah Deniz goes into decline. But this would be a consideration of rather distant future, probably 10, 15 years from now, at least.
Right, and the numbers, it seems, just are not very big from what I'm hearing.
No, it's like 3-4 BCM indeed for Azerbaijan own consumption.
I mean, you mentioned the 10, 15 years. I guess this leads us to our next question, which is obviously there's a broader commitment, particularly on the part of the EU, to make a transition away from fossil fuels altogether, decarbonisation. So maybe I guess the question here is whether this is just this transition from Russian gas is just accelerating that process. We have another question in the chat. Well, it actually says an observation rather than a question, but maybe interesting to debate. I suppose the electrification and renovation of actual buildings would lower the dependency on gas, but it would need massive investment and time. Max, why don't you take that one on?
Yes, definitely is the short answer. I'll use the question though to talk about one thing, which is, I would be relatively confident in the assertion, and I think a lot of other people are, that it is fair right now to talk about peak oil in the global environment. I am not so confident, and I think I hear fewer voices that would say we are at peak natural gas in the global environment. There are a lot of big LNG projects coming online all around the world, from Senegal to the United States in terms of export terminals, Qatar, Australia, obviously historic major producers, but a lot of oil supplying countries. And there is still a global shift going on in many places to switch from coal to gas. Gas is, of course, still a carbon fuel, but not nearly as much of an environmental pollutant as coal is. So, I think we're only now just seeing the beginning of age where natural gas is the most important geopolitical resource, and probably the full-scale invasion of Ukraine marked the turning point from oil to gas as that resource globally. Yes, electrification. Yes, the broader green agenda can help with that. Of course, advocates of the gas industry will always point out, well, hydrogen will need pipelines too, and these can be adapted. And there are pipelines in the world that have been adapted from one to another. But I'm, without taking an issue on all of the environmental politics around this, I'm saying just in the economic realities of the world now, if you're not thinking about natural gas as part of that transition, but instead if you're thinking about it as only part of the past, I just don't think you're seeing an accurate view of global energy markets. Now, there is a real risk, as sort of we alluded to earlier, of oversupply in the globe in the coming years. Global natural gas supply is increasing faster than demand. Obviously, 2022 was such a big shock in global markets. Basically, every LNG project around the world got a sign off. And even now, we see just at the beginning of this year, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, under the Trump administration, and despite its America First agenda, just signed off on one of its largest loans in a year, which is to support the development of a LNG plant in the far north of Mozambique, a country that almost fell back into another civil war this year, and which has an Islamist insurgency operating just outside the area where this LNG plant is located, and which infamously Wagner actually got hired at one point to try to clear out, but ultimately failed. Questions of gas geopolitics and LNG geopolitics, more so than pipeline politics of Europe, are going to be core to the energy transition, if not the ultimate endpoint of it, as well as to geopolitics for the years to come.
I would say that electrification provides a very useful capacity. It makes energy system rather agnostic of various supply sources. In terms of thermal efficiency, what happens is, at least now, people install heat pumps in their houses, and they use electricity instead of gas to get heat and hot water, but that electricity actually comes from gas. So you get a conversion. Gas goes into flame, flame is converted into electricity, electrons travel to heat pump, and then heat pump creates heat, and it's probably, from the physics point of view, slightly less efficient than heating that space with gas flame that will be going in the consumers' homes. And cost-wise, it's definitely not so profitable at the moment. That's why there's a quite strong pushback from consumers in Europe. So heat pump sales and installation numbers in the last couple of years were much below politicians' expectations. However, this issue of being agnostic is quite important. That, for example, if you have a gas supply issue, the homes are not single fuel anymore. It doesn't really matter whether electricity comes from nuclear, coal, renewable, or gas. Yes. So in that sense, it makes energy systems more resilient.
Right. That's very clearly put. Thank you. Sergey, we haven't talked about Russia, but I think it's timely to ask you about what the effect has been on Gazprom, this enormous giant and mainstay of the Russian economy for 30 years, of this cutoff basically of supplies to Europe, and how damaged Gazprom has been, and whether it's what damage this has done to Gazprom's economic model, and what you're observing as a long-time Russian energy observer.
Well, for starters, we probably need to distinguish between Russia Inc. and Gazprom. For Russia Inc., gas revenue from Europe was a substantial flow of money, but not nearly as high as oil, roughly 20% of all oil and gas revenues. For Gazprom, of course, European sales of 150 plus BCM per annum was the major source of revenue.
Right.
The bulk of Gazprom gas sales are actually domestic. Russia is highly gasified economy. Gazprom is extremely important to keep Russia well heated, well lit, and all the Russian industry going. But the price setting in Russia is such it's pretty much like the US. So prices are vastly different than what they are in Europe today, and even what they were in Europe, just 3-4 times difference. Gazprom has been trying to compensate for what was going in Europe, the market it kept losing, by building a pipeline to China, part of Siberia 1. It was developing fields in East Siberia, stranded fields that would have only China as their natural market. It was a multi-billion project, humongous, and last year it came to plateau. Now Gazprom supplies to China 38 billion cubic meters per annum, a very substantial amount, but still 4 times less than it's been selling to Europe. And the prices, they're not abysmal, but they're quite low. They're even lower than what China pays to Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. There is a paper on Carnegie website that analyzes the economy of that sales, the economics of that sales in fine detail. So Gazprom earns several billion per annum on those Chinese sales. It is profitable, but doesn't bring nearly as much rent as European trade did. Gazprom is still a profitable company. This year, it has posted rather high ruble profits by international accounting standards compared to the last year when it has posted as spectacular losses. Those losses had most to do with write-downs and write-offs of European assets it has lost, like Nordstream, like Gazprom Germania, and so those were paper losses, not cash flow losses. But now, despite these paper profits, Gazprom starts to see not yet existing, but looming cash flow problem, because Gazprom for many years was a company for which costs were not really an issue. It was a company designed to develop huge projects. And now it has that huge machine that's been accustomed to build and deliver huge projects like Yamal development, for example, which doesn't really know how to stop, but it has to. So Gazprom now has to cut its costs drastically, but seems to not know exactly how it's going to do it. It probably has recognized the problem, but hasn't come yet to agreement that the actions has to be drastic.
But does Gazprom still have the level? I'm obviously talking to someone who worked in Russia in the 1990s. Does Gazprom still have that level of political support from the Kremlin, or are there now, if you're sitting in the Kremlin, are you worried about the way Gazprom operates?
Now, Gazprom is quite important for viability as Russian economy as a whole. If you think what problems European countries had when gas supplies was interrupted, think what level of problems would Russia have if this would happen. So it is important, and people do get their gas bills, people do get their light bills. So for that reason alone, Gazprom is extremely important. Gazprom is also important for economic ties with China. It is important for China as well, because if, for example, for some reason, there is growing political tensions around Taiwan, much of LNG that China gets to it by ship through Malacca Straits and through Taiwan Straits. The gas route from Russia is overland. It's protected from these interruptions. So yes, Gazprom is important, but probably these days somewhat less important than, for example, military-industrial complex.
Right. But from what you're saying, there are probably people sitting in Gazprom headquarters, sitting and dreaming of the day when they could resume their exports to Europe.
Oh, definitely, for many reasons, for personal business development, for revenues, and so on. But we see that Gazprom export has been severely pared down. So probably their hopes are not too strong.
Max, back to you. In your paper, you ended with some very interesting analysis of the importance of Turkey, and I wondered if you could expand on that a bit about Turkey as an important gas transit country, an LNG importer, and this is not something which I think isn't possibly sufficiently on the radar of a lot of European policymakers, in particular, how that gas relationship could change the relationship between the EU and Turkey. Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. So I'll begin by saying Turkey has historically been a major gas importer and saw major increases in its own gas consumption over the last 20 years. As part of this, the successive Turkish governments, or various governments under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, have looked to increase gas supplies from a whole number of countries. We saw the construction in the early 2000s already of the first sub-Black Sea link with Russia, the so-called Blue Stream pipeline. We then saw really beginning in 2008, European support for the Southern Gas Corridor and the development of that Azerbaijani route that we unpicked a little bit more in detail. But Turkey also has the ability to import from Iran, and does have some imports from Iran. And then really over the last 10 years has been not just a regional, but a global leader in the buildup of its LNG facilities. So Turkey will import, is expected to import somewhere around 25 billion cubic meters more this year than it has in domestic supply. A lot of that does already get re-exported to Europe. There's the Turkish role via the Trans-Adriatic pipeline and that we spoke about earlier, the Balkan Stream pipeline, where the remaining Russian supplies still continue to go, and then discussions around other interconnectors. A new one has also been built between Greece and Bulgaria, so not directly connected to the Turkish network, but indirectly also benefiting from this. Turkey, of course, views gas as a strategic resource, not only for its own economy, but for the geopolitics of the future, including its own leverage in the relationship with Russia in particular. Now is the last remaining notable Western buyer of Russian gas, or Western, I mean to the west of Russia for these for this context, and also has more capacity in those LNG terminals than is contracted, so could actually even increase exports at current levels even more than that. Erdogan has claimed significant discoveries of gas in Turkish waters in the Black Sea as well, and also for Turkey, there's a geopolitical component around the waters around Cyprus. Probably in the remaining moments of this discussion, it wouldn't justify going into the myriad Cypriot issues and the division of that island between the Turkish-backed Republic of Northern Cyprus and the remainder of it. But there's been a lot of at least talk and exploration activity around the waters around there. So Turkey sees a future in which it can go from a net importer to balancing that out and using its role as a global hub to have a lot of influence there. The real question for Europe is, does it want to risk having dependency on one very large country, again, particularly for the Eastern European market? This is a question that doesn't just play out in relation to handling relations with Turkey and where asks should be made in terms of sanctions enforcement and the wider relationship with Russia, but also in terms of the wider European market for LNG imports of their own, and ensuring that it's not just Germany and Western European countries that essentially build up enough LNG infrastructure to leave themselves sufficiently diversified to be able to react to global developments and geopolitical issues regarding gas suppliers, but that Eastern Europe get that. I think it would ultimately be a poor outcome if, one of the risks throughout all this time and that we've spoken about was the dependency on Russia as the sole supplier. We saw those risks actualized very much so in 2022. And I'm not saying the level of risk from Turkey is presently the same, but I think structurally a key lesson has been importance. Diversification of routes is as important as diversification of suppliers, and that is something that should be borne in mind when the EU considers its strategy and with regards to gas and support for pipeline and LNG terminal investment going forward.
Thanks so much. Almost at the end, we got one last question. Maybe we can squeeze that in. Has there been any discussion regarding the potential involvement of an American entity in acquiring Nord Stream 2 and facilitating the transport of Russian gas to Europe? That's, I think, something that's been floated in the US, but I'm guessing that this is something the German government is, Sergey, is blocking. The answer is probably that's not going to happen, or unless I've been missing something.
Well, as I've mentioned before, Nord Stream 2 is probably sitting at the very bottom in the list of desirability of various gas transit routes for Europe.
Yeah, sure.
Particularly if Nord Stream 2 purchase is being discussed as a cheap and separate negotiations between US and Russia behind European and Ukrainian backs. So it might seem like as a sweetener almost to Russia, something that would be used to convince Russia to sign this sort of treaty and to make it stick by Trump and Trump allies group. But for Europe and Ukraine, I think this arrangement would be an anathema.
Yeah.
And there's also a very interesting issue whether it would be in the American interest as well. Because one of the reasons why Nord Stream 2 was sanctioned in 2019, and that was what Mr. Vitrenko mentioned in his memories. Mr. Vitrenko was heading Naftogaz Ukraine back then, was that Ukraine managed to convince US that Nord Stream 2 would be against American interests because it would create competition for the US LNG in Europe. So why on earth would be US interested in facilitating it now?
Yeah, I just while we still have a minute, I would fully echo Sergey's comment there. For any listeners who are unfamiliar, it has been quite widely reported that a former Moscow-based U.S. businessman, Stephen Lynch, has sought to do this by purchasing the Nord Stream entities in Switzerland for tax optimization reasons. These companies are formally owned by a Swiss structure that also had to do with their financing after previous sectoral sanctions and European sanctions activity blocked equity investments into the Nord Stream 2 structures from European companies that were, in my opinion, foolish enough to go along with supporting this project after the initial invasion of Crimea in 2014. And there would be a whole bunch of legal issues with buying up that bankrupt entity in the first place. Some of the same lawfare questions that we spoke about earlier would have to come to. But even if the U.S., which as Sergey clearly points out, was first targeted the company under the first Trump administration, even before Europe had been convinced of the folly of Nord Stream 2, even if it did lift the sanctions, it would entirely be up to Europe's control whether to use this route going forward or not. The only person I could see benefiting from this would be the investor, and then the Kremlin in turn, rather than Europe. We have seen Putin dangle other such deals. There's recently one with the hedge fund, 683 Capital Partners, sort of trying to, for me as a sort of person interested in the history of business in Russia and foreign investment, a lot of the structures that we've seen have been like, oh, Putin is using this to recall the greatest hits of the early 2000s when Western investors got to sit in between, the nationalization of Yukos and then the sale onto Rosneft and pick up, good returns for very little work other than maybe helping the Kremlin avoid some legal questions in the future. And so, I think this is clear signaling to those kind of people who the Kremlin may believe still have influence and leverage in these negotiations, or at least are listened to by current U.S. authorities. It is to finish with the pun, a pipe dream, and it should remain one.
Thank you so much, both of you. Our time is up. Plenty more to say, but we've covered a lot of ground, so I'd like to thank both of you very much. Urge and remind everyone listening to read Max's paper, which is on the Carnegie website, to read Sergey's analysis, which you can also read on Carnegie and elsewhere. Thank you all for tuning in. Also, thanks to Tanguy Babled in Brussels, who's organized this meeting. And we hope to see you again soon to discuss this and many other East European questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.